saying you've got to make use of it. Car phones would be handy, I suppose, that sort of thing. Anything to make life that much easier, I think, we've got to make use of.
We're a bit like detectives. We have a jigsaw puzzle which is multi-layered. I mean, it's like having several jigsaws one on top of another, blowing them to pieces with a 410 shotgun, throwing half of it away, dropping the rest on the ground, jumping up and down on it, and then you have to put them back together again.
They sometimes bring their horse, and if they bring their horse, some need shaving, some need straw, some have their own feed, some want feed provided. There are a number of other little items, like some want insurance, some don't, and so on and so on, a few other extras.
Yes, ma'am, Traffic Systems. Yes, it is. Right.
Traffic Systems Cooperative is a workers' cooperative set up by Alan Winkley and 6 of his colleagues when they were made redundant. They were fortunate in having the support of the local authority right from the start.
We didn't get financial backing, and the only backing that we've ever had is this place for 12 months rent-free on the initial start-up situation. We had no work at that time, but we did have a place, a nucleus in which a place to come and sit and look at one another, basically. The council were very helpful. They knew of us, of course, because they'd asked us, we'd been asked to tender, we'd applied to tender for work. They knew us experience in the area. They knew we were well able to do the work. So they were helpful. And they've got continual pressure on them to get prices down. We certainly have managed that. So the benefit for the council has been an improved service, and also at a rate that is better for them, really. We're basically responsible for the actual controller, the box that you see on the side of the road. The actual inspection sheet covers a whole range of equipment, including the signal heads, the poles, the detectors. We look after roughly 800 signal sites. Maintenance generates paperwork, and it was a problem to us. In the seven of us that started the business, with no office skills amongst the 7, people have had to learn how to run the office and learn how to manage, really.
With so many sites to look after, the paperwork began to take over. Each set of traffic lights works to particular timings, and the engineer needs to know these, together with the maintenance history of the site, before he can complete his check. So the first requirement was a system to look after the checklists. However, the computer would have to operate in all weather conditions and be able to take some heavy handling. The answer came with a tough handheld micro, which is connected directly to the controller. It records the timings electronically and then produces a printout. Back at base, this information is transferred directly onto the main computer to provide a full maintenance history of all the sites. The engineer now spends far less time maintaining each controller. Instead of having to record all the information from scratch, he just checks off the printout with the master checklist, and the problem of the paperwork is virtually over. Success with the checklists made them look for other ways of using the computer.
We wanted the software to do the costing part of it. Again, a mammoth task, because units are coming into the contract and going out of the contract as jobs, new jobs are switched on and old jobs are replaced. There was a lot of discussion in here at that time, about what we did want, and with the suppliers, getting advice on what was available. It had to be written for us. There was some investment for us to make, because it's not cheap, but I think it cost us about £3,000 just for the software, not the hardware to run it. But it's been well worthwhile. We had to run the 2 systems as old system and the new system in parallel for a period. That was to educate customers. You just can't abruptly change overnight and expect people to be happy about that. You've got to blend into the situation, which we did, and we got the new system up and running, and it took us about 3 months, I would think. The customer gets the feeling that you know what you're on about, so he gains more confidence in you, so hence you get more work. Very nice situation.
Discipline is very important when collecting information. The problem for Dominic Powlersland is that the archaeologist can only collect his information once.
We only have archaeology once. It takes, say, 10,000 years for a single site to form. If we put a motorway through it, we plough it to a depth of 3 feet, it's gone. Our resources come out of public money for the most part, or money that is donated by industry or charities. And we ought to produce the best possible return that we can from that investment. Well, there are 3 main areas which we're concerned with. The first of all is the location of things. We need to know where they are both in plan and also vertically, because of course the vertical space allows us to date things relatively one to another. And then there's the drawn record, the photographic record, which is a part which has always been a problem in terms of mass storage. You've got 15,000 slides, several thousand drawings, all of which tend to be large and cumbersome. And then there's the primary information on the soils and the artefacts themselves. So those are dealt with in 3 different ways. The 3-dimensional data is recorded using an infrared theodolite, which is basically a measuring device which measures the time that it takes for a beam to bounce off a mirror.
26, 13, 15, 10.590.
Then the drawings are all drawn by hand in the field, and the photographs are photographed in a standard way. But we're now working on methods of storing those images in computerized form. And then the primary records that I suppose traditionally have been most important, the written word, is punched into handheld computers in the field. And we have a series of programs to handle the soils and structural features and the artefacts. Now, in the past, people would have sort of taken 50 pieces of pottery, put them in a bag, and said, bag, 50 bits of pot. And of course, that limits the amount of work that you can do with it at the end of the day. We generate our own problems in that we record so much information that were we not to use computers, we would never be able to analyse it at all. The computer imposes a level of organisation which is absolutely essential once you get to large amounts of data. I'm not the most organised person in the world. If the whole thing had been recorded on a card index, there would just be piles of cards absolutely everywhere. And we would never be able to sort of, say, look at the distribution of frog bones, for instance, or snails. It would be impossible. But by looking at that sort of evidence, we can determine new things about the site which we would not have been able to identify in the past. Snails have very limited worlds. They can't run very far in their lives, and they live in very well-defined habitats. So that if we find a concentration of snails of particular types, we can demonstrate where hedges had been. Now, archaeologically, the ground, it looks like a boring flat surface with a few bones and occasionally a snail. If we then plot those, one against the other, we can isolate in relation to a series of ditches, for instance, where the hedge banks have been. And this allows us to reconstruct something of how the landscape looked at any given time. And this we must do, because it's no good just digging things up and sticking them in a museum. Everything that we deal with has been dealt with by people at some point. It's either been put there, lost there, or thrown there, or it's a function of the human environment.
To be able to use all the collected information and solve the mysteries of the past, Dominic and his team use many modern and highly sophisticated computers. When new members join the team, how do they take to this new technology?
The computer hasn't been around and about in terms of general use for very long, and so people tend first of all to be surprised that we're using them. but in terms of people working in the field, once they get over the initial shock of computer fear, they're quite happy to use them, and at the end of the day, they've universally felt that it's better to use the machine than to do things in the way that we have done in the past. We have this enormous data explosion. It's a relatively new subject. And if we're to be able to manipulate that information and actually give people back our interpretations of the past, we're going to have to use the technology that's available. Since we've been computerised, we've been able to produce better results, I think, than we could without them. Of course, the process of excavation is just the beginning of a long chain of events which should, at the end of the day, lead to a book or publication, both at academic and popular level. We have specialists all over the country who are looking at particular aspects of the excavations, of the human bones, the animal bones, and the objects. Now, in the past, there was an endless interchange of telephone calls and letters when they wanted to know some piece of information. Now, if we can send them disks with all of the data and in a standard format that they can then load on their own database, this makes the process of specialist research much quicker. So this is an immense improvement over what we've had before. People writing PhDs spend 75% of their time doing wasted work, trying to find where the information is. Well, if they can just get the whole lot on a set of floppies, the whole process will accelerate and, I think, improve, because people with all of the data there will be able to ask much more searching questions of it. If we take away people's memory, they're no longer functioning human beings. If we can expand on that memory, we may not learn from the past. I mean, we don't necessarily do so. I think we probably don't. But we probably become richer human beings as a result of knowing about it.
When the Doomsday Book was being compiled, I don't suppose citizens were concerned with how much information was being kept about them. Nowadays, there is a very real concern. And with me are Eric Howe, who is the Data Protection Registrar, hello, and Professor Chris Edwards, who's from the Cranfield Institute of Technology.
Hello.
Eric, you first. Why was the Data Protection Act first implemented?
Well, it really came from two concerns, one about privacy and one about trade. The privacy concern arose because with computers you can hold masses of information, you can quickly cross-connect and analyse information, you can take information virtually from anywhere in the world and bring it together with other information you might have. And there was concern that much of this information was about people, you, me, viewers of this programme. So the concern came, was the information being properly used? So that was the privacy concern. The second concern arose because other countries in Europe began to legislate to protect information about people. Part of that legislation could have meant that if we weren't using the same form of legislation, then trade with the UK could be damaged because information wouldn't be allowed to flow here because we hadn't got the same protection. Now, what happened then within the Act in order to meet those concerns? We had new rights created for individuals and obligations for computer users which create a climate, an environment in which they must carry out their computing in a way which protects individuals. So if I may deal with the rights, they are really threefold. First of all, people will have the opportunity to claim compensation if they're damaged, for example, by the use of inaccurate information about them in computer systems. They have the right from November to go to people who may hold information about them and get a copy of that information. And they have the right to challenge the information if they believe it to be wrong, challenge either to the registrar or to the courts. Now, computer users must be open about what they do with information, what sort of information they have, where they get it from, who they give it to, and they achieve that by registering details with me and I make the register public. The second thing they must do is carry out their computing according to certain principles of good practice, right, what we call the data protection principles, about keeping information accurate, processing it fairly, making sure it's secure. Now, as it happens, by good chance, those principles of good practice will be helpful to computer users as well as to individuals.
OK, so Chris, who must register under this Act?
Everyone is the easy answer to that. Anyone that processes information on a computer about living individuals must register. Let's take an example. Imagine that I kept records on a little home computer about other professors in the world. Little details that to you don't seem too difficult, like what their area of interest is, whether they like a drink in the evening, these sorts of things. And I was to keep that information electronically on a computer, I would need to register. Now, before you get to the stage of thinking, hey, I'm going to have to rush home and register, let's just find out what exemptions there are, because there are a number of exemptions that take people out of this Act altogether. Do you care to comment on that, Eric?
Yes, there are some exemptions, and perhaps let most of your viewers, or a lot of your viewers, relax immediately. If they keep microcomputers at home and the kids keep Auntie's birthday and the cricket scores,
Yes.
they use them for personal, domestic and pleasure purposes, then that's quite understandably and properly totally exempt from the Act, so they can relax. But there is a lot of misunderstanding about the exemptions. I read reports that the Act is ridden with exemptions, personnel systems are exempt, and health systems and police systems and so on are exempt, and all of those statements are wrong. There are some exemptions from the Act, and they may apply to some of the small organisations watching. There are exemptions, for example, for information held solely for the purposes of payroll or solely for the purposes of accounts. But they are very narrow exemptions, and if I may give an example, supposing that you use a clock card system and you take the information from the clock card, you put it in your machine, and you simply calculate pay from the number of hours worked, then that could, other conditions being met, be an exemption. But if you look at that information and say, why was Joe late 3 times last week, you're now using it for personnel purposes, and the exemption is lost. And the advice I would give to small organisations is, do take care, seek advice if you're in doubt, and really if you're in doubt and you think you'll use the information for broader purposes than these narrow ones, then it's safer to register.
OK, so if I have a small business and I think I ought to register, how do I go about it?
Well, what you would do is slip into your nearest Crown Post Office and get from them a data protection registration pack. That's free, you get it over the counter. It contains the forms and a book to help you fill them in and details of how you apply for registration to my office. If having got that you've got into difficulties, then there are other sources of advice, but that's the first thing to do, get that registration pack.
OK, Chris, where can we go for advice?
Business would go to those normal areas that it's gone to for advice for lots of things in the past. You would go off to your accountant. Accountants will know about these things. You might go to your solicitor. You might go to a trade association if you belong to a trade association. And I guess you've always got the possibility of contacting the registrar's office and getting the literature from there.
Yes, indeed. We provide booklets on the Act. We provide a telephone inquiry service. We dealt with 80,000 telephone calls last year through that, and something like 23,000 letters for inquiries about the Act. So we're used to dealing with inquiries. If people can't get that help locally, and they may well be able to get it because we've provided accountants and solicitors with packs on how they may advise on the Act, then do come through to my office. Use the telephone inquiry service. My office is in Wilmslow, just outside Manchester, easily findable through telephone inquiries.
Okay.
Do come to us for information.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Eric, and thank you, Chris.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome. Thank you.
We expect to find computers as part of the hectic life of the city. But what about the beautiful Yorkshire Dales, where Christopher Bartle and his manager Peter de Cosimo run the Yorkshire Riding Centre? Here, the pace of life changes little as the decades roll by.
The traditional role of a riding centre has been to provide instruction to the local community who want to come and learn how to ride and hire a horse and have a riding lesson. And that is the way, in a sense, the riding centre started. But from there, we've developed in various directions. We are now probably one of the country's top training centres for the training of students who wish to become either instructors themselves in the long run, or grooms and work with horses, or work somewhere in the horse industry. That represents about 50% of our work here. We are an active holiday centre during this period from April through to September. We market our holidays throughout the world, not just in this country, America, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand and so on. We also run shows throughout the year, indoor show jumping, dressage competitions, hunter trials. We put on demonstrations and displays. The facilities are available for hire by other outside organisations. We produce horses for sale to the public or to competition riders and so on. And we also provide a livery service to the local community. We do other chores such as clipping and preparing horses for competitions and that sort of thing. So it's a very complex set up and has become more and more so as we've gone on. One of our particular problems in managing the business is preparing the daily riding program. Each rider is a different standard and requires a different type of horse. A beginner requires a very quiet horse, a more advanced rider requires a much more trained horse. Secondly, size of the rider, the weight of the rider, the height of the rider, and so on. Now, each horse, for its own good, can only perform a number of hours in a day. Some horses, we would say, are capable of doing 4 hours, some 3, some 2, some 1, and so on. And we have to lay down these maximum hours and then try and fit the horses to the riders according to age, height, weight, riding ability, and the maximum hours that they can do. It's a very time-consuming exercise and prone to a lot of errors. This problem of preparing the riding list became more and more of a hindrance, really, to the daily program because it took more and more time of the chief instructor to prepare it. And so it occurred to me that it was, again, a function which a computer could help us to do.
2 offices now needed a computer, and Chris had to choose between 2 separate micros or a multi-user system, where 2 or more terminals share the brain of one computer. The cost, speed and ease of use had to be taken into account before making a decision.
Looking at the options, it occurred to us that it really was not going to cost considerably more to have a multi-user system than to buy 2 separate microcomputers and have all the problem of transferring information from one to the other and so on.
Let me find you first of all. Are you coming next week?
Yeah, same time, please.
Same horse?
Yeah.
That was Cameo, wasn't it?
Yes.
One of the most important things, as far as I was concerned, was that the system was easy to operate and that the commands or the menus that appeared on the screen were in plain English and would be understood by anybody, because the sort of staff that we're employing are not computer experts, they're riding instructors, not trained at all in the use of computers, and they have not, as far as I was concerned, not to be intimidated about using the machine. I tried to minimize the risk by being very clear in explaining to the supplier of the equipment exactly what I want it to do, and laying out in quite a lot of detail how I want it to prepare the riding list, how I want it to deal with the diary, exactly what we're doing now, and that it must replicate that and do better. And I have written into the contract that I would not be prepared to sign on the dotted line and pay for the equipment until I see it up and running.
But where he had been slightly S-shaped.
Going down the road of computerization has given me, in a sense, more independence, really. The time I have free, I now spend more time riding and schooling horses and doing other things. So my wife isn't any happier with me at the end of the day, but it certainly has freed a lot of time for me.
There are many issues which ought to be clarified before you buy your computer. Next week, how you go about getting impartial advice.